Oh dear, it happened again! Although arguably you could say that it was even worse than Hungary. And one thing to really stress here is that Lando Norris did not ask for this swap. You know, this whole thing kind of makes me reevaluate being a McLaren fan. It kind of makes me think, Vorsprung durch Technik. But more on that later. There were plenty of other drivers to talk about, including Max Verstappen. Well, how about that? Not just a pole to win affair, but something that reminded us of 2023 a little bit. Max winning the damn thing by 9 seconds. Yep, that takes us back, doesn't it? Because basically McLaren had absolutely nothing in trying to respond to Max Verstappen. Red Bull brought some upgrades for the remainder, I think, of the Formula 1 season, and it really hit a sweet spot, seemingly making the most of the low to medium speed corners of Monza, there only being one really high speed corner, that being the Bortoleto or Parabolica corner, the final one. But other than that, Red Bull were completely dominant. Max did what he did best in dictating the race pace from the front and making those tyres last. Sure, they didn't have enough left in the tank to go from the mediums to the softs, but those mediums lasted a really long time, meaning that he could absolutely coast toward the end on the hard tyres and not worry about them giving out. Although the blistering on the rear tyre was a little bit of concern on the C4s. And also it was really funny to see Max making quips again on the radio, GP telling him not to push, and then just no risk, and then Max goes, no risk, full push. Almost an allusion to the no risk thing that Ferrari did a couple of years ago. And seriously, the entire situation makes me think that Max is really flirting with the Tifosi. Italy is really warming up to Max Verstappen, and his dominant racing display without much complications certainly really helped those sentiments. And he broke the record of the fastest ever Formula 1 race by 55 seconds or so, nearly a whole minute. Well, I thought it was going to be really close, and then he got the fastest F1 qualifying lap in its history, taking it away from Lewis Hamilton. But most importantly, this was a very valuable reset, and the first ever Red Bull victory without Christian Horner anywhere near it. Very important for the optics of Laurent Mekies. Sure, you could say that, oh, Horner's influence is still there, and it's going to take a long time for Mekies to really make an impact, but it's really good optics for the team to show that they can still compete without the guy that started off the entire show 20 years ago. And also, it's just going to be part of Max's game plan for the rest of the year. Yeah, the title isn't going to be his this year. He's already understood this. He's going on a race-by-race basis, so as far as he's concerned, he's had a great weekend, getting pole, getting a win, in front of the Italian fans who are really starting to gain respect for him. And not to mention, Max's efforts have really brought Red Bull back into play for second place in the Constructors. They're only about 21 points behind Mercedes now, and hey, if Red Bull can get back up to third in the Constructors, that'll be a really huge save for the team concerned and something for the Mekis to really build on. And Lando Norris is technically a winner today, and I must remind you, Lando did not ask for the swap to happen. He remained silent on the radio after the race, and I think he knew that the optics were not going to look good in his direction. Yeah, it must have been absolutely morale draining that after having the most dominant car this season, they had no response to the Red Bull at all, which might mean that we are going to have a fun end to the season. The final third could be a humdinger in terms of a race-by-race basis, even though we know it's going to be a McLaren driver winning the championship. It was still something of a damage limitation exercise, and P2 finishing ahead of the championship leader, 3 points, getting it down to 31 points, the gap not too shabby for Lando. It was, all in all, a fairly reasonable weekend. Would you call this a bottle job for Lando? Absolutely not. It was just a reality check. On that day, Red Bull was stronger. There you go. Lando was just making do with what he had. He was picking his battles, which is a very valuable lesson in regards to Max Verstappen and thinking in the short term. You're not going to really win this one. What's the point of pushing hard and then maybe beaching it coming out of the first chicane, which can happen, or going wide, or spreading a little bit too much gravel and then completely wrecking your floor. And up until near the end, it was a bit of a ho-hum day for Lando, but not too bad. Then, of course, the pit stops happened, and it all completely changed. Yes, he did ultimately benefit from it, but did he really, in terms of the optics around him? Because I'm already seeing a lot of discourse that are seeing any goodwill toward Lando completely dissipate, that everyone's going, oh, Lando's got the team in his pocket, blah, 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 blah. I don't think it's as simple as that, which is why I am getting the foam out. Yeah, the optics aren't good for McLaren, the team. They are going to be getting their own segment later in the video, so do keep watching for that, which is why I am separating the drivers themselves. I think ultimately they would have preferred to have the deal done, the overtake done on the track in racing, because you just got to look at when they went onto the soft tyres, regardless of the 4 seconds lost in the pit stop. Lando was probably going to be overtaking Oscar anyway on those used soft tyres. I saw him closing in on his own before the swap command was put in. But I would have loved to have seen that happen, or at least a little bit of a pushback from Oscar in some way, but we didn't get that. It was an unsatisfying conclusion. And Lando was offered to come in first, but he declined, allowing Oscar to have that privilege, provided it meant that he wasn't undercut, which the team promised he wouldn't be. He was technically not undercut. He would have gotten ahead of Oscar had a front left change not hampered him and dragged out the time. And also, he did get booed a lot by the Italian crowd, which was really, really unfair. I suppose the Italian crowd were just taking out their frustrations and the fact that, oh, McLaren got another double podium, the Ferrari drivers were not on the podium at all, and that, you know, it wasn't hard racing, whereas Max was giving a real good display in dominant racing, which is what the Italian fans really like. But again, we'll talk more about McLaren in the dark bit. As for Ferrari, I'll call this a small win, but we have other teams to attend to. I would say they're here on the supposition that they had a quiet but reasonably solid race, far more composed than last weekend, and Leclerc's launch was electric, mugging Piastri a couple of times and having a really good battle between he and the Australian. That Ferrari was able to cause some trouble for Red Bull and the two McLarens. Those first few laps, seeing via the helicopter shots of those four duking it out around the Curva Grande, was absolutely mesmerising. That was amazing. I'm pretty sure that Tifosi would have appreciated seeing that Leclerc, for a brief moment, had the means to go after the top three, but it wasn't to be in the long run, with Leclerc falling back, and his main job for the weekend was to make sure that Russell was not going to get P4. So, yeah, close but no cigar in terms of the podium, but Leclerc still got some solid points in, which means the gap between them and Mercedes does extend, Ferrari concentrating on keeping second place in the team title. And as for Lewis Hamilton, yeah, he did have a 5-place grid drop because of that really dangerous mistake he made going to the grid at Zandvoort, but from there, Fred Vasseur very much said, what do you think Lewis Hamilton is back? And look at him, he was really motivated in front of the home crowd. And yeah, arguably he was. He really was fired up. He seemed quite happy. He was very complimentary with the pit stops, which were quite quick for him. He got up from 10th to 6th place. And it makes you wonder what would have been had he been able to start from 5th place on the grid. Maybe he might have had a shot in Lewis and Charles going after Piastri, who did look a bit vulnerable toward the end of the race after having cooked his tyres battling Leclerc in that opening stint on the mediums. So you got to just really look at it from a perspective of Zandvoort. Zandvoort was a horrifically bad weekend. Fast forward a week, Monza, 4th and 6th, not terrible, could have been much better, very, very small win. Ferrari looked punchy, which is why I'm putting them in the winners section instead of the mess section. Had they had no response and the top three just gone off immediately, then I would reconsider. But I'm certainly not going to need to reconsider Alex Albon's situation because he's up here again, and this is just making me say, yet again, how the blazes did that driver get up there? He started 14th and he went to 7th? He again overtaking his teammate who outqualified him. What? Yep, that's just exactly what Alex did, and his achievement of getting P7 and being able to make up some names means that Williams have now surpassed their 2017 points tally, and they're only 14 points shy of getting into triple figures, the first time they've done that since 2016. This very much saying that Williams is back, baby. Alex started on the hard and ran long while others squabbled, and he just simply didn't break anything. He managed the first stint well with metronomic pace and then dealt with all of the late race chaos around Antonelli and wasn't really all that bothered about it. 7th was the reward, and one of his tidiest Sundays this year, in fact, on balance and tyre life, and he did get some assistance from Carlos and being overtaken, but he did have the longer tyres. The bigger picture, though, is really, really spicy, and it brings him ahead of Antonelli in the championship. Aston Martin scored zilch, and James Vowles, the optics of Williams beating a Mercedes, albeit a rookie driver, is certainly very, very good in terms of the overall standings in trying to net a few more sponsors. And then you just got to look to Gabriel Bortoleto, another consistent jockey. Sure, he had a very slow start to the season where he wasn't really making as much of an impression as I would have hoped for, but around Monza, where he had his breakout race last year, he did exactly what he needed to do. Sure, he did ultimately finish behind where he started on the grid, but quite frankly, with Lewis Hamilton behind him and then overtaking him, it's not that big of a deal. And you've just got to look at what he was able to do with his manager Fernando. He did so maturely, only losing out in the stop because ultimately he was a little bit too timid on the brakes, whereas Fernando wasn't, and he did make up time, and then Bortoleto had a slow stop. Did that fluster him long term though? Not really, and Yeah, Fernando's suspension failure helped him out a little bit, but he kept it clean and grabbed another 4 points. And yes, Alex Albon did overtake him and take away 7th place, but you've really got to look at the bigger picture here. This was yet another weekend where a rookie, the Brazilian rookie... Oh no, sorry, I forgot to do it. So, yeah, points finish for Bortoleto. It's a sign he's speeding up really, really quickly, and it's really going to impress a lot of people, especially Audi, but a rookie who's only going to get better. They're in good hands, that team. I'm really looking forward to what they can do. And again, I probably will be supporting Audi as well as McLaren. Maybe Audi even more so if we get more, artificial gaming out of this from the management of McLaren. And Sauber, they're still in the P6 hunt. Really good weekend. And then I said this on Twitter, and I will say it again here. Hey, Isack got a point. Nice one. Especially considering that Racing Bulls had a really terrible Saturday and Isack started from the pit lane. He only goes and nails 1 point. Sure, it's 1 point, but it brought them 1 point closer to Aston Martin in 6th. Yes, it's not the 15 points from Zandvoort, but honestly, I think Isack will take it because they bolted in a fresh power unit around a power circuit, really good, and told Isack to go long, and he nailed it, and he didn't need a safety car to help him out either. And it really keeps VCarb in that bubble on a Saturday which looked really, really pessimistic. Isack was able to bring the team some hope. They gave him a plan, and he was able to convert. So, therefore, Hadjar gets the final winning position here. Because we now need to move on to the mess section, and Oscar Piastri starts off this category. Now, you might be thinking I'm being really unfair toward my boy here, but you've really got to look at the bigger picture. That battling with Charles Leclerc at the start of the race, having to overtake the Monegasque twice, I think, really did a number on his medium tyres, which had to really go nearly an entire race distance. The achievement in of itself on the McLaren to be able to do that quite competently, without losing too much time to people behind him, Leclerc, on harder tyres, was a really impressive feat. But it meant that really Oscar didn't have much to give. He really got stuck a few solid seconds behind Lando. And the reality is this. Had the swap not been asked for, Lando may have overtaken him on the used softs eventually. But at least we would have had a long track slog for it and seeing Oscar defend. His pace, Oscar's, was solid on the wheel, but awkward on the radio. McLaren did pit him in first. It was unusual given track position, but again, he got it because Lando offered it up to him. He didn't want to take up first dibs. On pure pace, Oscar was in the top 3, yeah. But the story became more than that, and really got us questioning McLaren's practices again. Yeah, I don't think Oscar is going to be all that flustered. He didn't lose that many points. Had this been him giving up the win for Lando, that would have been a bigger issue for everyone to deal with. I mean, I don't have any water, but it certainly would have been a situation for Piastri and Matt Wither. But it's still something not ideal, and it doesn't look good in terms of optics, because from many people's perspectives, they'll be thinking, Piastri, what the heck, man? Where's your killer instinct here? Why didn't you just act selfishly and just go for it? Well, it's something I'll talk about more later on, but I think it's because Piastri and Norris think far too in the long term. Their long-term future with McLaren instead of the here and now and just gunning it. And what Piastri's situation really showed is that McLaren is still quite draggy. In low downforce configurations, it's not that great, and they're not going to have mini DRS to help them out around Baku, which might make things a little bit tricky in order to make it back-to-back victories around Azerbaijan for the Australian, but I think he'll certainly give it a damn good go. But it really depends on what happens in terms of the optics of McLaren and what they do in terms of damage limitation. So yeah, Oscar did okay. He was a top 3 driver, but he certainly was compromised by him getting a little bit too aggressive with Leclerc. Not a bad thing. I like that racing. It was great seeing he and Charles tangle it again. They complemented each other after the race, but it certainly did not help him trying to get back at Lando on the track. As for Mercedes, they looked the least impressive of the front runners. Not terrible, but they weren't exactly compelling viewing. Even though George did give Charles a little trouble near the start, he did fall back. From there, it was mainly managing the gap to Hamilton rather than attacking the Ferrari, so yeah, bit quiet. Yeah, in contrast, Antonelli's afternoon was a little bit more noisy. Sure, it did result in him ultimately scoring points, P9, one better than Hungary, but certainly a few less than what he was able to do from Canada, this being 9th, his best result since Montreal. Was it really that long ago? Blimey. And yes, he did have another weekend with a time penalty compromising his overall result. Only 5 seconds this time around for driving erratically, and it meant that Bortoleto managed to get 8th place instead of the Italian. But okay, fine. 9th place, coming back from a dreadful free practice session, qualifying in the middle of the Q3 roster, that's perfectly reasonable, and the Italians had at least another thing to be pleased about with an Italian being in the top 10. That is okay. Not bad, but it is a sign that Mercedes would just, bleh. And then Carlos Sainz. I'm not going to be too harsh on him because he was very, very, very close to squeaking out at least one cheeky point. But ultimately, this was yet another race where he just could not keep himself clean. Albon was going longer, and not long afterwards, Sainz did complain that his mediums had gone. He would have only been holding up the tie driver, but Oliver was not forgotten, because the Haas tipped Carlos into trouble with the stewards, getting back on Carlos's Christmas card list by proclaiming him the innocent party, but a wounded car he had, and that meant points were denied him. But hey, at least, like with Albon, the pace was real before he sustained damage, and it meant that Carlos had something in the tank to be able to progress from P13 to P11. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it was another weekend where he just simply couldn't catch a break and just have a quiet day in getting back into the top 10, where we all thought Williams were going to qualify. Q2, both of them on Saturday, that was a real underachievement, as I described in my qualifying winners and losers video. Albon once again getting all the glory, whereas Sainz didn't really get anything, unless you really take into account that his pace is getting better. It would be just really nice for him to be able to get a point or 2 or 3 or 4, you know, as some kind of unnebulous reward, as in it's tangible, it's points, because yeah, Williams are locked in P5, having a fantastic season, but Sainz isn't bringing home the bacon. I think he would like to do more. Then it's Liam's turn. You might think I'm being generous, but starting 18th on soft was a cheeky punt, which Lawson nearly made work when the undercuts were really coming his way. But then the usual thing happened. Traffic. People coming out on fresh tyres, and the degradation across all was proving to be a lot lower than expected, especially when you look at the front and the medium tyres nearly going 50 laps. That is bonkers. And then he had a tangle with Tsunoda, which made things worse. He sustained a little damage, and that was that, really. Yeah, track position was crucial, and really, Lawson was compromised, but he still managed to make it a good go. He did a reasonable effort on that really big cheeky punt strategy there in terms of the softs. It nearly worked, and tyres that weren't as a big of advantage as they all thought. And now we get to the bit that you probably skipped toward. McLaren, what were you doing? Off with you to the dark pit! Look, I get it. A double podium is a fine result. It's perfectly reasonable given how Max was so good. Yet the narrative escaped their hands, and it meant that the results, they didn't count for toffee. Nobody cares. And as I mentioned with the two drivers, I think it's because McLaren are really all about team first. They really stress upon both their drivers that they are not bigger, that they have to comply. It's the success of the team which counts more, and they don't really count in the grand scheme of things, because if they put one toe out of line far too many times, then they're out the door. They could be sent packing. They're not worth more than they think they are, and that is a really important tell here. It's all about the team. And look, I understand why they decided to do it, that maybe they wanted McLaren to take away the onus of one particular person making a mistake, to not punish Norris for a mistake that he didn't do, although I think Lando really would have been okay with it being something that was out of his control, and as Piastri put it on the radio, something called motor racing. And on paper, it really should have been simple, and that they should have read the situation on the used soft tyres. Oscar was losing ground despite the mistake, the 4 seconds lost in the pit lane, and Norris probably would have overtaken him anyway. And we would have at least had a bit of a resistance from Oscar, and then we would have said, well, okay, Lando was just better on the soft tyres. That's that, really, and there would have been no harm done. But no. We're talking about this, something that we are then comparing to Hungary 2024. You could hear the surprise in Piastri's radio, him sensing the goalposts had been moved, as he believed that incidents in the pit lane were not something that papaya rules would cover. And Norris saying nothing on the team radio after the swap really painted a picture that he knew that was going to be blowback coming. The self-inflicted noise really turned that clean P2, P3 into a talking point. It's going to be going on for days. Let me know in the comments, by the way, if you want me to make a full detailed video about this. I'm going to be out of town tomorrow, so I'll be back on Wednesday, so do drop a like or a mention in the comments if you'd like to see me go into a little bit more detail about this topic, because I'm pretty sure people are going to be discussing this in very heated debates. And despite McLaren wanting to make things fair and not really punish Lando for something he didn't do, it's just something that meant that McLaren artificially changed things that probably would have happened organically had they not interfered. But at least in terms of Piastri's PR, he was able to at least do some damage limitation and him complying immediately, unlike Lando last year around Hungary, where it took several laps for him to ultimately give Oscar. Piastri was saying, I don't like this decision, but I'll do it for the team. He was doing everything that he could. So in terms of Oscar supporters, they'll be saying, yeah, look, our boy complied at once, unlike Lando, which is only going to cause more animosity between. If there is going to be a spat between these two drivers and the fan base and the garages, it's going to be the blowback after this. So McLaren helping, they weren't helping. And it all really just begs the question, and it brings out the spanner. Roles reversed, for example. If this had been a situation where Lando had the 1.9 second pit stop, I think it broke the record for the DHL fastest lap thing, and then Oscar had the left front malady, would they have swapped roles? Max's response to all of that, the scoffing after he heard that from GP, I think that pretty much sums up what the wider paddock sentiment was regarding it. And then when you hear Toto saying it sets a dangerous precedent, yeah, McLaren, that was a dung goof moment. And all the while, with Max sort of flirting with Mercedes and sort of flirting with Ferrari in the long term, yeah, he's not going to be driving for McLaren if this is how they're going to act. Yeah, he made his feelings clear, Max. And now the losers proper. And despite Behrman finishing 12th, this race was not clean. The stewards pinning the blame on him regarding the tangle with Sainz, and he got a 10-second penalty for his trouble, and 2 penalty points in his license, which means he's only 2 points away from triggering a race ban. The same position, ironically, which Kevin Magnussen wound up in last year, which gave Behrman another go in a race last season. So the next few races are going to be very important until the first of those 10 points expire, which I don't think is going to be happening for another couple of months. And it just really goes to show that even though Behrman has got the pace, he is not at all somebody who is clean with the stewards. Him getting multiple grid penalties for overtaking under red flags. He has not been a trouble-free driver, although he does have the pace, he does have the speed, he's just not clean in terms of execution. But if you take away the incident, the weekend was full of promise. He was reasonably quick, he only just missed out on Q3, he only fell down 1 place despite the 10-second penalty, so it wasn't all that bad. It just shows that Haas has got a driver for the future, or at least until Ferrari give him the call-up, that they can depend on. They just need to make sure he doesn't make these mistakes where he gets grid or time penalties. He really did cost himself a shot at maybe P10, taking it away from Hadjar, but them's the breaks, really. And then there's Nico Hülkenberg. Not much to say about the German, really, because he didn't really take part in the race. He didn't. He had to come in, box to retire the car from P12, which was really, really unfortunate. They are still diagnosing the trouble, but they would rather try and preserve the components that were okay instead of making things worse, because they got to make parts last, and they really got to prepare about what they're doing with the cost cap. And it really goes back to what we were talking about around Silverstone, is that Sauber C44 is a really quick car, but it might be a really fragile one, and they need to make the most of what they got. They really got to be careful, and Hülkenberg had to pay the price for it. And it was a shame, considering that Hülkenberg has been more often than not out in Q1. He's usually a qualifying specialist. Gabriel running rings around them at the moment. This would have been a decent fight back where he himself, the German, could have bagged a couple of points from P12. It could have been, but it wasn't to be. Rather cut and dry situation here. But it wasn't cut and dry for Yuki Tsunoda. I'm sorry, but this was weak. Sure, Yuki did get into Q3 again, and that achievement is something credit should be afforded to him, but on the race day itself, disappointing to say the least, especially given how Max not only won the race but dominated like the good old days. This was a grind, and once Antonelli overtook him after Kimi completely fell down at the start, it was all downhill for the Japanese driver. Yuki reporting that the car felt really numb, and it meant that he couldn't capitalize on starting P9, which would have been a nice little boost after Max gaining 25 of them. And then I think he also noted that he wasn't running the same upgraded floor package that Verstappen was being run. And okay, that might explain some reasons why he wasn't as quick as Max Verstappen, but the fact remains that he wasn't able to capitalize on all the other stuff I think he was afforded. It might mean that in Baku he might have a better time of it down the really long straights. He might be in contention for Q3 there and converting it into points, but right now, this was just not a clean weekend at all, especially considered he started in the top 10 and then fell out of it again. And then getting embroiled with an altercation with Liam Lawson, the guy you replaced at Red Bull, yeah, that's not a good look. That's not going to help. I know that Mekis is maybe thinking about consolidating the drivers that they already have, especially considering that Arvid Lindblad really didn't do himself any favors in F2. I mean, I don't really want to embroil myself in it because he's already getting a lot of heat on social media from what I've seen. He's not even in F1 yet, even worse than what Alex Dunn had to suffer at Monaco. But you're just wondering that, oh yeah, Alex Dunn being considered for Red Bull. Did not have that on my bingo card, but there's no really much room in the McLaren at the moment. But yeah, no, this was not a good weekend for Yuki at all. And then Ocon with Haas, he rolled the dice, they rolled the dice on the longest hard tyre opener in the field, hoping for a safety car that never came. Despite many of them being seen in the junior categories, it never arrived for the F1 outing. And worse, he then picked up a 5-second penalty after squeezing out Stroll. And then he had to pit in very late, and he didn't have much time to recover on the softs. As I mentioned earlier, the degradation proved to be lower than expected, and it meant the gap between soft and medium tyres was not as big, so it really ultimately wasn't worth it. If they had some medium tyres to play, they may as well just been on those, and they could have pushed a little bit harder. And the long-term season understanding of Haas is this, is that they can scrap with the midfield, and when it comes to attrition, they can score points, but in terms of execution, it's just not to be. With both drivers securing time penalties, and in the case of Oliver, penalty points, it just means that there is too much to talk about regarding these two to just consolidate both Haas drivers into one segment for the team. There was just too much. And for Aston Martin, it was too much for them to bear, considering that their hopes were really raised when Stroll crashed out in 17th, as to be expected, and then somehow Alonso was able to get into P9 in Q3, despite we all thought it was going to be a really draggy car. And then on top of that, he could have almost had P7 when he was battling with Bortoleto, especially considering that he and Gabriel were ahead of the Tsunoda train and they had their own little spat. But then the suspension visibly failed, and that was that. Not much else to say, really. And as for Stroll, this really reflected their expectations and no safety car came to help them. The car is better than expected though, but it just was not quite enough. And now the onus for the rest of the season is to try and get some reliability back into that car. The performance seems okay. Fernando has been really consistent in scoring points as of late, and Stroll has been able to have some fairly decent outings here. And then, around a low downforce circuit where they expected to be terrible, they were competent. So they really just missed out here on at least a few points, and it means that VCARB are now just 1 point behind them in P6. Yeah, okay, P7 wouldn't be the worst thing out there considering they're all really thinking about 2026, but, you know, it was something that they thought they could have gotten, but they were denied. And then Alpine closes us off. It's a power circuit. Need I really say more? They split strategies to create variance, and Gasly took on a new power unit and started from the pit lane. Then ran forever fishing for a safety car before they changed the softs, which really yielded nothing, as I mentioned with Ocon. Colapinto ran the typical strategy, and he was doing okay for at least a little bit. Him being able to still remain ahead of Gasly as he outqualified the Frenchman, let's remind you here. But then he locked up. It meant that he had compromised tyres, and that was that really. And it meant that he had to yield when Gasly came in steaming on the softs, and yet again, more awkwardness in terms of swapping positions. It's just a case of Franco being able to do something in that car. He's steadily making progress, but that car around these tracks, Baku, also another power circuit, so don't expect too much from them. Yeah, it's just unfortunate for both drivers, and there must be something going on behind the Team Enstone outfit since Gasly is committed to them through 2028, so just remains to be seen, really. And one important thing to remember here is that them keeping Franco would be pretty useful since, well, he certainly has a lot more experience with Mercedes-related power units than Gasly does, that's for sure. So just a little bit of, you know, foam for thought there in closing. And then in closing, I would like to suggest something that might tickle your fancy. This video here in particular. You can go and watch that right now. I just got to go and change my clothes, so I'll be right with you.